Hello everyone. Tonight we have a fire gently crackling in the fireplace. Everything is still outside, and to entertain you and lull you to sleep, I'll tell you more stories from Greek mythology. 4 different stories, together with their context and possible interpretations. So make yourself comfortable and let the tension go in your shoulders before we begin with the first story, the story of Pandora. Long ago, there was a time when humans were all male. There were no women, and men lived naked and uncivilized around the world. Humans were weak in comparison with many wild animals. They had no fur to keep them warm. They had no thick skin to protect them. They were not armed with big teeth or claws. They could not fly to escape. And one day, the Titan Prometheus decided to do something for these poor creatures. Prometheus stole the secret of fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. Men finally got an advantage, one that surpassed any advantage given to other species. With fire came not only comfort and protection. It was the first step towards knowledge, the taming of nature, and with them, culture, civilization. Men had received the spark of divinity with this gift. For this theft, Prometheus was punished harshly. This is a story I told you already in a previous episode. The king of gods, Zeus, had taken revenge on Prometheus, but he was still not satisfied. Humans had to be punished too, or at least limited. They could not be left alone with this new knowledge of fire that would undoubtedly demultiply their power in the future and maybe make them defy gods one day. Sometimes Zeus liked a quick and brutal revenge. Other times he preferred to plot and let a convoluted plan unfold. This was the choice he made this time. Humanity would be punished, but punished by the consequences of its own actions, and punished forever. For the first part of his plan, Zeus went to Hephaestus, the craftsman and blacksmith god, who lived in isolation, away from most other gods. His own mother, Hera, had cast him off Mount Olympus, the god's mountain, because of his lameness. And so Hephaestus lived in his workshop, uninterested in the adventures and the feuds of other gods. He crafted equipment for them, objects that were as perfect and beautifully made as he was ugly. Objects such as the winged helmet and the sandals of god Hermes, the messenger of the gods, or the chariot of Helios, the sun god. Zeus went to the reclusive Hephaestus and asked him to model a new creature, a human woman, the first woman ever created. From clay, Hephaestus modeled the body, and life was given to it. Humans had not been created to be perfect, and how could they, when they were created by gods who were themselves imperfect? But an effort was made for the first woman, or at least so it seemed. Each god cooperated by giving her unique gifts: beauty, intelligence, eloquence or strength. She received all these qualities and was named Pandora, the all-gifted. But these gifts were all double-edged, ambivalent, and this was part of Zeus' plan. Pandora received intelligence and eloquence from Hermes, but the messenger god also gave her with it a shameless mind and a deceitful nature. Hermes also gave her talent to lie convincingly. Aphrodite made her graceful and attractive, which meant men would lose their minds and their judgment in her presence, and so on. Pandora was a creature as beautiful and smart as she was dangerous and unpredictable. Such was the weapon that Zeus had crafted to diminish and punish men. Once this was done, the king of gods went to the brother of Prometheus, Epimetheus, and offered him Pandora as wife. Before he was punished and chained to a mountain for bringing fire to humanity, Prometheus had warned his brother, warned him to never accept a gift from Zeus, because he knew the king of God never gave away favors and gifts without hidden motives. But Epimetheus was charmed by Pandora, and he forgot about his brother's warning. He accepted her. As a parting gift, Zeus had given Pandora a large jar, a pithos, in which the gods had put different plagues, some physical, like storms, diseases or earthquakes, others immaterial or emotional, like fear, desperation or delusion. The Supreme God was confident Pandora's nature would do the rest, and that she would soon disseminate these plagues, because she would carelessly open the jar, unable to resist the temptation to do it, just because she could. And he was right. Soon, even though she had been instructed to not open the jar, Pandora became curious of what it would be like if she opened it. She did not resist the temptation for long. As soon as she opened the jar, all the plagues it contained spread around the world and started to afflict her kind. From this moment on, humanity became at the mercy of illness, disasters, and self-destructing impulses that would slow down and always threatened its cultural and technical advancement. A legend says that, realizing her mistake and its tragic consequences, Pandora tried to close the jar. And one of the emotions stayed trapped in it: hope. Hope that some see as a blessing and others as a curse for mankind. Zeus' revenge was complete. A human had brought countless calamities over its own kind, And even though he had plotted all this, the king of God would consider his hands were clean, since he hadn't done it himself. The story I just told you is one of the most famous versions of this Greek myth, and we owe it to Hesiod, an ancient Greek poet thought to have been active between the 8th and 7th centuries BC. A contemporary of Homer, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Like with Homer, it is unsure Hesiod actually existed or was a single person. He could be a pseudo-author, a name to which different works were attributed. You certainly heard of the term Pandora's box. This is what the figure of Pandora is most famous for. To open Pandora's box means to unleash disasters out of carelessness or an excess of curiosity in an action that is irreversible. These calamities or these consequences are here to stay. They are like toothpaste, they won't go back into the tube. That's the origin of the phrase. But in all ancient versions of the myth, as written by Hesiod and later retold by Greek and Roman authors, it was not a box that she opened, but a pithos, that is to say a kind of large amphora, a container that was used for storage. It became a box much later, at the time of the Renaissance, 2000 years after the earliest known written versions of the story, when pithos was translated as box, and the word remained. But this is a technical detail that does not change the meaning of the story. There's a lot to say about it. At the surface level, this myth works as an obvious cautionary tale about careless actions. It is also a myth that explains or tries to make sense of the presence of evil or evils in the world. It speaks of our human condition. You may have also noticed that the storyline of the first woman, created after the first man, and who lets evil into the world involuntarily, inadvertently, driven by impulses that she cannot control, is something rather familiar. It sounds a lot like what happens in the Hebrew and Christian Bibles, when Eve accepts the gift that leads to the expulsion of men from Eden and the end of the first golden age that became out of reach forever. And yet another thing that deserves to be discussed is that the figure of Pandora is not limited to this myth. Greek myths about Pandora exist in different versions, sometimes contradictory. And Pandora was also the name of an ancient goddess or a mythical being. So, as you see, there is a lot of things to tell about this apparently simple story. And we're going to take them one by one before moving to other myths. Now that we have begun our little mythology night, please take a moment to adjust your position if you are not perfectly comfortable. You can close your eyes whenever you want. If you let go and fall asleep, you can always come back another time. I also invite you to check my Patreon page if you wish to support this channel. The support I get from each patron is very appreciated, and patrons keep this channel going without ad breaks for everyone. You can also listen to my stories on Spotify, Apple Music, and other music streaming sites. Releases on there have been disturbed for a few weeks because of technical problems, but I'm told that they should resume very soon. And for another take on the stories I craft for you, I also invite you to check Lights Out Library, a new podcast and channel that is basically the retelling of my stories, but in the feminine voice of Sarah, the editor and host of this new program. It is soft, in good English, and we hope this channel will do well too. I'll put links in the first comment under this video. And now, let's go back to Pandora. Like a lot of myths, the story of Pandora calls for various interpretations, or can be looked at from different angles. First, there is the most obvious one, the cautionary tale about the consequences of acting carelessly, which can lead to tragic consequences that cannot be undone. She opens the jar, and the world is changed forever, afflicted by plagues we still live with. If we go a little further, the tale also provides an explanation for the presence of evil or suffering in the world, which is another common function of myth, to make sense or provide a backstory for phenomena that affect mankind. This particular story can be seen as something called a Theodicy. What does it mean? Theodicy is a term used in the philosophy of religion that was coined in the 18th century by a German philosopher, Leibniz. It is made of Greek words and means literally vindication of God. A problem that kept theologists and philosophers thinking at the time and even before was the problem of evil. How can we reconcile the existence of a God that is all-powerful, benevolent, and who knows everything, with the reality of evil and suffering across the world and in humans' lives? In other terms, why does a God, or gods, who are all-powerful and wish us well, allow this to exist? The Theodicy is an argument, or in some cases a backstory, that tries to reconcile these apparently incompatible things. In many mythologies, there is one or several stories that explain how evil and pain came to spread across the world, an event that typically puts an end to a mythical golden age that would have existed before, and from which suffering was absent. To many antique civilizations, like classical Greece, the presence of evil in the world did not necessarily clash with their conception of the divine and their conception of gods. They did not believe that their gods were omnipotent nor omniscient. In many Greek mythological stories, gods hide information from each other, and they act out of ignorance sometimes. And they are not seen as always benevolent, neither. They could absolutely punish men, sometimes unfairly, They had very human pulsions and desires. And in the case of ancient Greece, the Olympian gods were also not the creators of the world. They just lived in it. They happened to have powers and be eternal, but they were not the creators of the universe. So, to the Greeks, the gods themselves were subject to pain and emotions. They could be petty, cruel. They had whims. They made mistakes. The coexistence of these gods with suffering and evil in the world was not theoretically problematic to them. But still, the existence of this myth seems to indicate the need for a backstory, an explanation for why plagues and suffering affect mankind. As a matter of fact, the myth of Pandora's box explains the spreading of plagues as a very intentional plan, elaborated by Zeus. It's a revenge, a punishment against humanity to take it down a notch. If there is a message or a morality here, it would be more the need for humanity to submit to divine decisions, to forces of nature that made plagues inseparable from our human condition. They came from above and should be accepted as such. Now this problem of evil looks theoretically more complicated for ulterior religions, in particular Judaism, Christianity and Islam, that are based on the existence of a single God that is all-powerful, who created the world we live in, who created mankind, and is also benevolent. Philosophers and theologists from these different traditions have analyzed the problem and also come up with arguments, with theodicies, that are as many attempts at reconciling the benevolent and all-powerful God with the reality of evil. They can consist of arguing that evil or suffering are part of a broader plan that works for a greater good, or that the existence of evil is the consequence and also the condition for the free will of man to exist. There are different versions of this argument, but they come down to this: free will, real liberty for men, is impossible if men are not left free of doing evil or of ignoring the commandments of God. And therefore, eliminating evil would deny humans their freedom. This is what a theodicy is, and the myth of Pandora, as told by Hesiod, is one of the most ancient theodicies we know of. Returning to more historical considerations, the thing that makes the character of Pandora more complex is that the character was not invented by Hesiod. Everything indicates that it was a very ancient figure in Greek mythology. She existed long before Hesiod wrote the myth in the form I told you before. And after him, the story was rewritten, adapted, many times during antiquity. Hesiod used a mythological character that, in earlier versions of the myth, was sometimes married to Prometheus, not to his brother Epimetheus. And in these earlier versions, the jar could well have contained only good things for humans. In that case, Pandora would have been a kind of female counterpart to Prometheus. The husband stole fire from the gods to give it to mankind, fire being a metaphor for knowledge and culture, and the wife, Pandora, distributed blessings to humankind. What supports the existence of this earlier myth is that Pandora means the all-gifted, as we saw before, but it can also mean the all-giving. It works with these two versions, with these two myths that give her a completely different function. And another argument in favor of good Pandora is that she was depicted on ancient artifacts, on pottery, with an alternative name, Anesidora, she who sends gifts. So, historians believe that even though Hesiod's version of the myth is the one that lived through the centuries and is now completely associated with Pandora, ancient Greeks may not have all seen her as a negative figure. Maybe depending on the period or on the regions of the Greek world, the two versions of the myth coexisted. Another observation to make is this strong and obvious misogynistic undertone to Hesiod's story. In summary, the creation of the first woman was decided by Zeus as punishment. Before it, there were only men, and humanity was fine. The first woman is the individual that brought disaster. Hesiod's story acknowledges the qualities of Pandora, but she cannot be trusted because she lacks control, she lacks reason. She was given a treacherous nature. Of course, she is just a character, but as the first woman, she obviously also represents an archetype. This is an extreme case in Greek mythology. There are many feminine figures in Greek mythology that are painted in a more positive light. Goddess Athena is a generally positive character, or Aphrodite. They support the heroes we are invited to root for. Another type of woman is Penelope, Odysseus' wife, who is a model of virtue and loyalty. Some women are powerful too. They can be warriors, like the Amazons. Another possible trap would be to call misogyny every single flaw attributed to women in Greek mythology, because males were also represented with major flaws. All characters in these ancient stories are imperfect, including gods. But mythology also reflected what Greek society was at the time. Most of the time, women in these stories are praised for their beauty, their loyalty, the care they provide, the children they bear. When they are positive figures, it is almost always as a source of inspiration for male heroes. They very rarely drive the action of stories, and when they do, it is generally as villains or ambiguous characters like Pandora in Hesiod's version, or Medea, a character I already told you about in the myth of Jason and the Argonauts. Medea was a queen and a sorceress. She begins as a helper, but she ends very badly as a murderer, because she cannot get over it when Jason abandons her. In these stories where women are some of the main characters, their lack of control over their impulses and their ambivalence are very often highlighted. They are the bringers of disaster, even when they don't wish to. You can also think of Helen of Troy. There are a few exceptions and more ambiguous situations, but these archetypes of characters about women come back a lot. They reflect the position of women in Greek society and also served to justify it. They were barely given any political role. They had less rights, and except for a few rare members of the elite, they were not given much education. Maybe one last observation to make about the myth of Pandora is the similarities with Eve. Each is the first woman in the world, and each is the central character in a story of transition from an original state of abundance and ease to one of suffering. A transition which is brought about as a punishment for transgression of divine law. Pandora opened her jar, whereas Eve accepted the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, even though they both had been warned not to. Did the myth of Pandora inspire the biblical story? It looks possible, even though rather than Pandora inspiring Eve, it could also have been a storyline that circulated in the Eastern Mediterranean. And both stories, both figures, would be illustrations of the same tradition. We know that Greek culture heavily influenced the Levant in the last centuries BC. The classical myth of Pandora was known to the first Christians, and they saw in her a type of Eve. Some historians have argued that Hesiod's take on the myth, which basically gives a bad role to Pandora, could have influenced the interpretation of scripture in a sense that makes the first woman responsible for the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Not that Eve or Pandora were bad or had bad intentions, but they lacked the will to resist temptation. They were frivolous, and this made them dangerous for themselves and for others, because they drew men to sin. The view that women would be by nature more exposed to sin and dangerous for that reason has been dramatically toned down in modern mainstream Christian and Jewish doctrines. But a few centuries ago, it was commonplace in Christian theology or in morality treatises to read that the nature of women, their essence, made them more at risk of letting evil in, with all the consequences this implied. Their morality had to be scrutinized with extra care. Their behavior had to be kept under control, their unstable emotions kept in check, because they were inherently weaker and dangerous for that reason. This kind of typical misogynistic stereotypes did not appear with the myth of Pandora, of course. The myth just reflects views that existed in an ancient society. But the storyline of the myth of Pandora was certainly used as an argument to perpetuate these stereotypes, to vindicate them. Our next myths are going to be the Danaïdes and Sisyphus. I mention them together because they came to symbolize the same thing. Pandora's box is about the calamities brought about by curiosity and carelessness. The stories of the Danaïdes and Sisyphus are about the absurdity of a laborious but futile task. First, the myth of the Danaïdes goes like this. Once upon a time, there were two twin brothers who were also kings, Danaus, who ruled over Libya in North Africa, and Egyptus, who had conquered Egypt. Danaus had 50 daughters, the Danaïdes, and Egyptus 50 sons. The number of sons and daughters they had, and the fact that they were brothers, created a risk of succession war when one of them would die. To avoid it, it was decided that the 50 daughters of Danaus and the 50 sons of Egyptus would marry between them, strongly binding the two branches of the dynasty together. But as the wedding date approached, Danaus consulted an oracle, and the oracle revealed that the intentions of the 50 sons were not to marry his daughters and live happily ever after. It was to kill all of them just after the wedding, after they had secured their rights to the inheritance. So Danaus decided to escape with his daughters. They all sailed from Libya to Greece, and they arrived in Argos, a city of which Danaus became king, with the help of goddess Athena, who wanted Argos to prosper and become a powerful kingdom. But Egyptus, the other brother, and his 50 sons would not accept it. Egyptus ordered his sons to pursue Danaus and his daughters to Argos, and to force them to comply with their promise to get married. The 50 sons arrived in Greece and threatened to lay siege to Argos with their army. The city was not well defended, and Danaus had to accept the situation. He agreed to the 50 weddings. But he could not ignore nor forget the oracle's prediction, and he was convinced that his daughters would be killed on the day following their weddings. So he instructed them to hide a long needle in their hair, and when their husbands would have fallen asleep on their wedding night, to use the needles to pierce their hearts. And so it was done. The 50 marriages took place, were consumed, and when the sons of Egyptus fell asleep, the daughters of Danaus went for their needles and killed them all. All but one. One of the daughters, Hypermnestra, spared her cousin and husband, Lynceus, because during their wedding night he had respected her desire to remain a virgin. She had been touched by his respect and could not kill him. Hypermnestra and Lynceus escaped Argos, knowing that Danaus would not let them leave. But as soon as he could raise a small army, Lynceus returned and took revenge. He captured Argos and killed Danaus, together with his 49 murderous daughters. He and Hypermnestra went on to start a new dynasty, a new dynasty of rulers in Argos. The myth provided an origin story for the kings of Argos. But it was not over for the 49 daughters. They had died, and their souls descended to the world of the dead, the kingdom of god Hades, to be judged for their actions. For the murders of their cousins, they were sentenced to go to Tartarus, to hell, where they would be tasked to wash their sins off by filling a large bathtub with jugs of water. Only when the bathtub would be full would they be allowed to escape from Tartarus. But the gods liked to play tricks on mortals and give them false hopes. Hades was no exception. The bathtub had a leak, and every time the Danaïdes would empty their jugs in it, all the water would escape. Because the water constantly leaked, the Danaïdes would forever try to fill the tub and remain condemned to stay in hell for eternity. Rather than a cautionary tale, the story of the Danaïdes is a tragedy, because their responsibility in the murders is dubious. They obeyed their father, which was compulsory for daughters, and acted to save their own lives. So they are also victims in this story. But as we saw before with Pandora's story and many other myths, Greek gods were not always about justice, benevolence, and compassion. A similar punishment, but that sounds more deserved this time, is the one inflicted to Sisyphus. So let's take a look at this other myth. Sisyphus was the founder and first king of another Greek city, Corinth. He was known to be crafty and to efficiently rule over his city. But he was also avaricious and deceitful. He plotted, and he held grudges that he would not let go of. For example, against his brother Salmoneus, also a king, that he repeatedly tried to kill or dethrone. So Sisyphus was involved in multiple stories of revenge. For example, one of them was his beef with a neighbor, Autolycus. Autolycus was a son of god Hermes, and from his father he had received the power, the capacity, to steal cattle without ever being taken. He could transform the animals he stole so that they would not be recognizable, and their rightful owners were unable to claim them back. Sisyphus owned a large herd of oxes, and Autolycus lived near Corinth. So at night, the thief captured some of the oxes. He transformed them to change their appearance, and added them to his own herd. Day after day, or night after night, Sisyphus saw his herd decline, and Autolycus' herd grow. He strongly suspected foul play, but could not accuse Autolycus of theft, because the oxes no longer looked the same. Sisyphus imagined a trick to prove that the animals were his. Secretly, he engraved his monogram under the hoof of his oxes. As usual, Autolycus came at night, stole a few of them, changed their appearance, and took them to his stables. At dawn, Sisyphus only had to follow the prints of his animals, which led them straight to Autolycus. And there he could accuse him of theft and use the monograms under the hoofs as proof. Autolycus was punished harshly, but that was not enough for Sisyphus, who took advantage of the situation. And while the citizens were brutalizing the thief, he entered his house and assaulted his daughter. Another time, Sisyphus meddled into the affairs of Zeus, and that would be the starting point of his downfall. Zeus had kidnapped a young and beautiful nymph, Aegina, the daughter of Asopus, a river god. As he often did, Zeus had set his eyes on this young beauty. But he knew that his wife, Hera, and the father, Asopus, would not accept this relationship. So he decided to capture and hide Aegina, so he would be able to do everything he wished with her. Zeus turned himself into an eagle to capture the nymph and take her to a cave on a mountain, a cave she could not escape from. But Sisyphus had seen the kidnapping. He knew where Aegina was now hidden, and with this precious information he went to Asopus. Of course, he would not give that information for free. That was not his style. He exchanged the information against a favor. Asopus would grant him a magical spring on the Acropolis of Corinth, a spring that could never go dry, in exchange for the location where his daughter was kept prisoner. Asopus accepted, Sisyphus got his spring, and the river god could go deliver his daughter, Aegina. Zeus had been offended and ridiculed, which he would not tolerate, and so he decided to punish Sisyphus brutally. It was no time for a convoluted plot. Zeus just summoned the god of death, Thanatos, and ordered him to go take Sisyphus and make sure he would be judged harshly when he would arrive to the realm of Hades, to the world of the dead. Thanatos went to find Sisyphus, but instead of supplicating or accepting his fate, the king of Corinth thought of a trick. He offered Thanatos to show him a few of his inventions. Thanatos had few occasions to be entertained, as the personification of death. His existence consisted in visiting the living and end their physical lives. So he accepted to see the inventions. Sisyphus showed him handcuffs that he had just had made, and as the god of death inspected them with curiosity, Sisyphus closed them on his wrists and made the god prisoner, after which he jailed Thanatos in his palace. Sisyphus had trumped death itself, And this had consequences. People stopped dying. Zeus was infuriated and could obviously not tolerate the suspension of death. So he summoned the god of war, Ares, and ordered him to go free Thanatos and also take Sisyphus to the world of the dead, from which almost no one could ever come back. And so it was done. Ares went to Corinth, freed Thanatos, who could resume his work, took Sisyphus, and made him cross the Styx, the river that marked the entrance of the kingdom of Hades. But once again, Sisyphus had seen it coming. He knew that the capture of Thanatos would not end the beef with Zeus. So, before another god came for him, he had ordered his wife to not organize funerals for his dead body. She was to let the body on a bed and prevent anyone from burying her husband. And she followed his instructions. Meanwhile, Sisyphus had been presented to Hades to be judged. The king argued that he could not enter the realm of the dead as long as his physical remains had not been properly buried. And he offered Hades to return temporarily to the world of the living to take care of this. After which he promised he would come back and accept whichever judgment Hades had for him. Like Thanatos before him, Hades was not used to such deceitful behavior from mortals. He ignored that Sisyphus had not been given a funeral because he had prevented it voluntarily. And so the god of the dead accepted to release Sisyphus, against the promise he would return as soon as the funeral would have been sorted out. Sisyphus returned to the world of the living. His dead body suddenly reanimated, but obviously he had no intention to go back to the underworld, so he did not organize his funerals, and instead resumed his life. He had cheated death for the second time, and made a mockery of the gods. This time, the gods agreed that it could not go on any further. Thanatos was sent again to take him, present him to Hades, and he was sentenced to spend eternity in Tartarus. But Zeus and Hades came up with a special punishment for the man who had thought he could surpass them in cleverness. Sisyphus would have to roll a boulder endlessly up a steep hill in Tartarus, and the boulder was enchanted to make it roll away from Sisyphus before he reached the top. This consigned the fallen king to an eternity of useless efforts and frustration, an inability to achieve anything. As we listen to these stories and rest, somewhere in the underworld, Sisyphus keeps rolling his boulder, in the hope that this time he will reach the top. But again, the boulder will fall down the hill, and he will have to go down and resume his task forever. Sisyphus was ultimately punished for his hubris, that is to say, his excessive pride and overconfidence in his abilities. He forgot his condition, and brought about terrible consequences on himself. Mostly on himself this time, but many Greek myths warned against hubris, especially in sovereigns and powerful individuals. This mix of overconfidence and pride could bring disasters on an entire people. Think about risking the wrath of gods, or going to war without measuring the consequences. Another well-known myth that tells of hubris is the myth of Icarus. To conclude tonight's story, let's relive it. Icarus was the son of a talented architect, Daedalus, and Daedalus was employed by the king of Crete, King Minos, who made him draw and build the labyrinth, an immense maze in which he placed the Minotaur, a half-bull, half-man creature. I told you about this myth already in the story about Theseus, the hero who defied King Minos, entered the labyrinth, killed the Minotaur, and found his way back with the help of a ball of string given by Ariadne, Minos' daughter. He followed the thread back to the entrance and escaped Crete with Ariadne to return sound and safe. The story of Icarus takes place after this one. King Minos was enraged by the death of the Minotaur, by the treason and the loss of his daughter, and her escape with Theseus. The labyrinth was now empty, and Theseus had avoided its traps. This called for someone to be punished, and it would be Daedalus. Together with his son, Icarus, the architect was imprisoned inside his own labyrinth. But despite the labyrinth being his own creation, it was way too big and complex for Daedalus to remember its entire map and find a way out. So it seems the father and the son were condemned to die of starvation. But the architect was astute and resourceful. Inside the labyrinth, he found different materials and fashioned wings with them. These wings were made of feathers kept together by beeswax, stuck to their arms. And so when they would flap their arms, like birds did with their wings, Daedalus and Icarus would be able to fly. The plan worked, and soon Daedalus and Icarus rose above the labyrinth with the intention to fly away from Crete and return to Greece. But before, Daedalus had warned his son that the wings were fragile. He should not fly too high, too close to the sun. Otherwise heat would melt the wax, nor close to the sea, because the feathers would become wet and stop working. Icarus promised to follow his father's instructions, and the two left the island behind, flying above the sea. The fear and anxiety of captivity was now disappearing, as their escape turned out to be successful. And Icarus felt more and more joyful and confident, so confident that he disobeyed his father and soared into the sky, higher and higher. curious to see what the world looked like from such a high point, and eager to discover up to which height he could rise. And as he did it, he came closer and closer to the sun. The heat began to melt the beeswax holding the feathers together, and one by one they fell like snowflakes. But Icarus only looked up, and did not notice it. He kept flapping his arms, until he realized that he was no longer climbing. And so he looked at his wings, and saw that he was now only flapping his bare arms. The wings had gone, and Icarus fell from the sky like a stone into the sea, where he drowned. The lesson here is rather straightforward. Icarus had everything to successfully escape. He had even been warned about the risks of flying too high. But overconfidence and a lack of realism made him forget all this and led to his fall, literally and figuratively. This myth has crossed the centuries. It gave rise to the phrase "fly too close to the sun." And it has also attracted attention from psychologists and psychiatrists in modern times, who identify the psychological pattern in it, a form of overcompensation that makes individuals formulate grandiose aspirations, despite not having the means to, because they lack realism, or they compensate feelings of inferiority by going to the other extreme. The term Icarus complex was proposed for this. Even though in its original form, the myth invites to avoid flying too high, but also flying too low, which would also have been dangerous. It can also be seen as an invitation to find the appropriate balance. We have reached the end of our stories for tonight. You can now let go and fall asleep. Or, if you're not sleepy yet, pick another story from my library. I will be back soon with a new one. And in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.